Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us again for another safety conversation with Mojo AI. I'm Jeff Panting, the Director of Marketing here at Mojo AI. And again, I've got Brian Camper with us to talk about safety.
Hey, how's it going, guys? And Jeff, thanks for having me here. And really look forward to talking this topic about heat illness and heat illness prevention.
Yeah, that's right. As we're getting into summer, it's June now. This is a topic that starts coming up a lot, but I feel like people kind of ignore it because it is, kind of a regular thing. It's every year. It's like, oh, we got to have the heat training again, and
Right.
then, I mean, in some places, this can be almost a year-round issue. I'm sure you're familiar with that in some of the places you've worked
Yeah, I
over
mean,
the
so
years.
overseas and even in places like Southern California, it's 90 degrees in December now.
Yeah, yeah. So to start out, I'd like to get your perspective as a safety pro. Like, why does heat awareness matter to the typical frontline worker, like, and to the organization they work for?
So that's a two-part question. I'll give you the two-part answers. And for the first one, right, for the frontline worker, it is a matter of comfort, right? If there's no heat illness prevention put in place, and it's hot, right? And it doesn't even have to be hot outside. It doesn't even have to be over 75 for heat illness to actually be prevalent, right?
Hmm.
But, at a certain temperature and a certain workload, the amount of uncomfortability and fatigue that is put on that worker increases dramatically as the temperature goes up and as their exposure goes up to it. Right? It's the same reason football players take breaks. It's the same reason basketball players take breaks. They have their timeouts. It's the same thing with your workforce. Um, on the business side of it, it piggybacks right on top of that. If you have a workforce that's out there and they're exposed to a lot of heat exposure, a lot of heat fatigue, heat illnesses starting to creep up like heat rash, heat cramps, you're going to see production go down, right? You're going to see less work getting done and you're going to see a greater liability coming your way, right? Without these measures put in place.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to ask a little bit about some of the things you just mentioned. You mentioned several different types of heat illness there. You said, heat fatigue, heat cramps. Can you talk a little bit about some of those different symptoms and what they look like how they manifest?
It all kind of starts. I mean, if you look at heat illness, it's kind of like a set of stairs. It's an escalating set of stairs, right? And at the very bottom of that set of stairs, there's heat rash, right? And we've all got heat rash at one point of our life, whether it's playing baseball, whether it's riding a bike, whether it's at work. We've all got heat rash at some point. Prickly little bumps, usually in the folds of your skin, armpits, back of your knees, and it's uncomfortable, right? It's where sweat pools up and your pores can't, really get rid of it. Easily treatable, but that's kind of the first step, right? You get a heat rash. Again, very easily treatable, very very easily to deal with, and from there you get into the second step. It's heat cramps. You start to get a little bit of that cramping going on, whether it's in your legs, your arms, your stomach. And where heat cramps kind of are a bit deceiving is they really come almost after the fact, right? They don't really happen during the workday. Heat cramps generally actually affect you after the workday or when you're trying to go to sleep, and they'll make it very uncomfortable to try to go sleep.
Hmm.
And you don't necessarily associate it with being exposed to heat illness until you kind of put two and two together. Um, the third step, and by the way, there's five major steps, and we'll go through them real quick. I'm trying to make this as quick as possible. The third step is fainting, right? You got your heat rash, your heat cramps, and kind of your third warning is people will faint, right? Not
Hmm.
everyone, but people will faint, and you'll get dizzy, you'll get fatigued, right? And this has to do with the dehydration, with the low blood pressure, right? Because as you're getting more and more dehydrated, it's harder for your body to regulate your blood pressure, right? As well as everything.
Huh.
And if you have any contributing factors like diabetes, maybe pre-existing low blood pressure or high blood pressure, it could affect you a lot more. So you have fainting, and that's going to scare anybody in the workplace if someone just faints, right?
Yeah.
And it's not really the fainting that's the issue; it's the falling, right? Because where are you going to fall? In workplace, there's
Yeah.
stuff everywhere, right? And then you start to get into the alarm bells, right? You get into heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion are, and by the way, as we talk about heat illness, it's all compounding, right? So as you go up the ladder of heat illness, it's all compounding with each other. Heat exhaustion is a combination of all those signs and symptoms, along with much more fatigue, disorientation, also maybe some nausea, right? And then the ultimate level of heat illness, and the one that it's a killer. It really is. By the way, the other steps are very easily treatable. Let me make sure that and we'll talk about that. But all the way up until heat exhaustion, treatable with moving into a cool shaded area, get some water in you, get some snack in you, take a break. You're good to go, right? But once you cross that threshold from heat exhaustion to heat stroke, you're now in a full blown medical emergency, right? And
Mm.
it can be fatal, and it has been fatal, unfortunately, in every industry in the world at some point or time. And people will lose consciousness, and people can even internally bleed. They can. There's a number of things that go on. The headache is just massively splitting. But those are the different levels. Not to take a lot of time on those, but those are the different levels of heat illness.
Do you have, just some general tips that you've employed in your safety programs over the years to help mitigate these effects of heat in the early stages so that they don't get to the heat stroke phase?
100%. And let me kind of circle back a bit. Heat illness is one of these industry hazards that this might sound a little bit controversial, but it is 100% avoidable, right? With very minor adjustments and very minor measures put in place. Some of the best things is your training, right? You're updating your IIPP, Incident Illness Prevention Plan, right? With your heat illness prevention. You're disseminating that information out to your workforce, right? And you're putting together this heat awareness campaign. We talked about in the last one with the safety meetings, making visuals, right? Putting visuals out there in the workplace about, hey, it's hot, right? Make sure you're taking your break, you're drinking water. Make sure you're coaching up your supervisors, your frontline supervisors on what to do, how to interact with the workforce. The little extra bits. Again, we talked about creature comforts. Make sure there's water available, right? Make sure there's Gatorades. You want to be careful with the Gatorades because obviously we don't want just people chugging Gatorade, right? But mixing it up a bit, squincher, the little squincher packets that you can pour into the bottle of water, shake it up. It's got electrolytes. It's like Brondo, right? It's great for you. It's good for plants. It's good for people too. Those of you old enough, you'll get that reference.
I get it.
Yeah, but making sure that that stuff's available. I always like to put some freezer pops throughout the workplace. You can't do it every day. You can't do it throughout the day, but put some freezer pops out there. Little items in PPE, the little wet cool towels.
Yeah.
Oh, those go a million miles. You get those soaked, you get those wet. Get people wearing them on their necks or up on their head. Man, they're great. During this time of year, everywhere I've went, we'll start a campaign. Water bottles, the cool towels, um, extra sets of Gatorade and water out there in the workforce. And if it's an outside work environment, making sure there's some sort of shade somewhere, right? There's an actual cool down place that they could go to, and it's away from the work area where they're not exposed to work or the noise or the radiated heat. And they could actually take a second, cool down, get some water in them, get in the shade. And I know that sounds like a lot, but it's actually really small things to put in place. And you put those small things in place, you're going to keep your workforce going, and you're going to keep them going from, and along with the training, from ever even getting past that heat rash, right? So those are some of them. Do you want me to expand on some of those, or do you want me to kind of hit on some of what the regulation says with those, or just the common sense, common practices?
Do you feel like OSHA provides enough good information about heat mitigation and heat illness so that if, a newer safety pro doesn't have that built into their program yet, that they can look to OSHA to get, a solid starting place?
They definitely can for the minimum, right? And to get a solid starting place, like you said, OSHA definitely isn't going to tell you like to buy freezer pops or to get cool towels. They will recommend PPE adequate for the temperatures, right? And if you don't supply that type of PPE and say you have an incident, OSHA is very much a gray area. They will say, "Well, we told you it's required, right?" And so now you're in a neglect,
Ah,
situation with OSHA. So while they won't tell you to go get popsicles, they won't tell you to go get cool towels. It is there written in there, and if you just go by the OSHA standards, yes, you will meet the requirements. And as you learn your workforce as a new safety pro or a new supervisor, new operations manager, whatever it might be, you'll learn the additional measures to put in place to keep your workforce healthy during this time of year.
one thing that we chatted about a little bit the other day that I was hoping you could expand on is some of the treatment best
Yeah,
practices as you start to see heat illness symptoms higher up on that scale.
just to stay with the time, we'll kind of go with heat exhaustion and heat stroke, right?
Sure.
Because heat rash, heat cramps, they're solved very easily. Cool water, shade, get some food in you. Don't put lotion on your heat rash. Don't clog up the pores, and it'll go away, right? Heat cramps, eat something, carbohydrates, some bananas, some oat muffins, something. And also, so this is going to be huge in construction, and this is huge in the oil field too. During heat illness prevention measures and during times of high heat, we have to avoid soda. We have to avoid the energy drinks, right? Can't be drinking the monsters, the Red Bulls, right? They're some of the biggest dehydrators out there, right? They will absolutely suck the electrolytes and stuff out of your body. They'll cause what's the word? Coffee is it dehydrates you.
Diuretic.
You're diuretic. They are some of the biggest diuretics out there. So staying on point about heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Heat exhaustion. When you get someone to the point of heat exhaustion where they're flush, right? Their skin's flush, and at that point they may have even stopped sweating, right? Because that's one of that's a bad sign when you stop sweating.
Yeah.
They're nauseated, they're confused, they might be dizzy, they're fatigued. You want to get that person as quickly as possible into a cool area, right? You want to get them in, you want to get them sat down, not laid down, sat down. You want to get them sipping on some water. And when I say sipping, sipping is a key word there. You don't want them chugging it, right? You get them chugging it, what's going to happen? Ugh, it's going to come right back out, right?
Ah,
And
okay.
now they're even more dehydrated. You want to get some ice on them. And this is important too. We're going to talk about how shock can be induced by rendering aid to someone. But when you're applying ice to someone as a cooling measure in something, heat exhaustion or heat stroke, you can't splash it on them, right? You can't douse them with cold water. You can't just pour ice on them. It's very important where you put it and how you put it on, right? So that's another measure that should always be put in place too is you should always on your work site, near your work site, you should have some frozen bottles of water or ice or whatever it might be under the armpits, in the groin area, and behind the neck. If you apply ice to those three areas, your cooling to the core temperature of that individual is so much more rapid than if you put it on their chest or if you put it anywhere, on their forehead. Those three areas are responsible for the largest amount of exchange of our blood, right? For those arteries, right? So under the armpits, in the groin area, and behind the neck, you will get that cooling sensation to the body that is much more effective than anywhere else. You don't really want them eating anything. This is different than heat cramps. You want them just to sip water, and you want to give them plenty of time. And this is going to sound kind of morbid too, but you don't want to leave them alone, right? Once you get them into that situation, and I'll tell you why it's going to sound morbid, or actually, I should have said dramatic. Once you get them in that situation, you're rendering aid. You want to render aid, get them recovering, and even though they're starting to seem like they're recovering, you don't want to leave them alone and say, "Okay, I'll come back and check on you." Is even though they're recovering, that sense of confusion and the mental fog can still be there. And we've actually had it happen where that individual wandered outside to go take a smoke because he was feeling better. And then the exposure to the heat restarted his symptoms, and he actually passed out. No one knew he was outside, and he was outside in 102 degrees temperature on the asphalt, right? He ended up spending quite a bit of time in the hospital over that. So monitoring that is also a big part of the treatment. Heat stroke. Um, Once you're dealing with heat stroke, you're going to do most of the same things as you're going to do with heat exhaustion. You're going to put the ice packs on. Heat stroke, though, we're going to get a little more invasive, right? And you're gonna fall under the Good Samaritan law. Um, if you're suffering from heat stroke, we're going to get that ice and that cool rags and everything right onto your skin. We're going to take off your clothes as much as possible, right? You want that cooling contact as much as possible. You don't want to give them any liquids, right? Especially if they're unconscious, right? Because what's
Yeah.
going to happen? They're going to drown, right? Or it's going to, So you don't want to give them anything to eat. Um, even for their headache, they're going to be begging you for something because that heat stroke, the dehydration, the migraine is just intense. You can't do anything for them, and you got to make sure you have someone calling 911 immediately, right? Because at that point, you are in a full blown medical emergency, right? But these are the measures that you could put in place to save someone's life until the medical professionals arrive. Get cooling on them. Don't be embarrassed. Get it right on their skin. Get them secured in a cool, shaded place, right? Bring their feet up, right? So that their knees, even if they're laying down, their knees are up, right? So you're getting that circulation and it's not just laying flat. If they can sit up, you definitely want them sitting up, right? You want
Versus
to
laying down.
right laying down flat, or if they have to lay down in a recovery position, right, to the right side, on the right side, which is the recovery position, um, and just stay with them until medical professionals arrive. But again, I can't stress enough: don't douse them with water. Don't let them pour water on themselves. Don't just pour bags of ice on them. Don't fill up a bathtub or something like that with cold water and just dump them into it. You will induce
Yeah.
shock, and you can very quickly escalate the risk of it being a fatality.
Is there a clear cut line where heat illness symptoms become a reportable incident?
You can have heat rash if it's treated the wrong way, turn into a recordable, right? If you go to an occupational clinic and they give you a prescription for some sort of topical skin cream, heat stroke is definitely going to end up being a recordable, right? Because it's going to require medical treatment by professionals. Heat exhaustion, it depends on your how quickly and how effectively you treat that and you get with that individual, right? And also a bit of their resiliency, right? They're recoverable. And that's something else that we haven't really touched on yet is it's kind of like sunburns. As your body is exposed to heat illness and the different stages of heat illness, you actually become more susceptible to it as well. So while Sam might get it once and he might only get heat cramps at one point, right? And then he comes back to work the next week, he's doing the same thing, doing same work, same temperature. His body is fatigued still, and that exposure is now compounded. He might go into heat exhaustion, right? So
Yeah.
heat exhaustion can be recordable. It cannot be recordable. It depends on the individual, right? On the signs and symptoms and the treatment applied. It also will depend on your organizational response.
So it sounds like catching these symptoms early and treating them while they're less severe is a great way to keep your your recordable incident rates down.
100%. And having these trainings and having a place to facilitate this training, having a place to conduct observations, to be able to talk about heat illness, whether it's in PTPs, tailgate meetings, like I said, your safety observations, your visual campaigns, these are all going to play huge factors into this, right? And you're 100% right. The measures, when they're put in place and that they're monitored and that they're managed, because heat illness too is definitely a manager's responsibility, right? Yes, it's the workforce's responsibility to make sure they're drinking water and things of that nature, but it is 100% on the operational staff to make sure that those measures are in place, they're being enforced, that the employees feel safe in order to take breaks. And that's something else too, is in the construction industry and the oil and gas industry, we're all a bunch of machismos, right? We're a bunch of macho guys. We don't want to take breaks, right? We could shovel 20 yards of concrete, no problem. We can drill a hole, an oil well by ourselves. The reality is, in this type of heat and this type of environment, you as the worker have to be willing to say, "Hey, I'm not feeling that great. I need to go get some water. I need to cool off." And you need to have the wherewithal and the ability to approach your supervisor to do that. And you as a supervisor have to recognize, hey, it's not, it's okay. I would rather Jeff go and take a 5-10 minute break, get some water in him, get recovered, and be able to come back to work and still work 100% than me work Jeff for an extra hour. Now he's at heat exhaustion, and now I might not see him for a week, right? So an employee standpoint of view, there's the onus on you to do it and so that you can keep working and keep earning a paycheck. And from the employer point of view, you want to put these measures in place and you want to make sure that you're catching it as quick as possible so that you can remain profitable and you can still get the work out of your workforce, right? Because even though it is a safety measures, it is still here to ensure effectiveness and efficiencies and productivity, right?
Right. Have you ever run into challenges trying to implement heat mitigation efforts? Like maybe when you're talking to leadership or somebody else who's not out in the heat all day,
Yeah.
maybe they get the luxury of being in the air conditioning all day and they say, what are you talking about? Heat? I don't know what you mean.
That's actually a really good question. And I would love to say that the answer was no. No, every upper management and every leadership team is 100% supportive of every safety initiative. But the reality is, yeah, sometimes there is some misunderstanding on these type of initiatives. The Gatorade, the freezer pops, maybe things like that. And you have to really educate your leadership team, right? Not only your workforce, but your leadership team, and you have to educate them with not only the facts, some stats, some training, and even the regulations, right? And make sure that they're aware of their responsibility in all of this as well. Um, Pushback is definitely, again, you just have to deal with it head on. There's no compromise. In heat illness prevention, you can't compromise, right? Because you're compromising. If you compromise, you're risking someone's health and possibly, if it's not taken care of the right way and it's not dealt with, possibly their life. And I say that not to run on and ramble, but I've lost someone to heat illness, right? Um, on two different job sites in two different countries. It's a horrible way to go, right? It's not a there's not a good way to go, but it is up there. It's up there with drowning and being in a fire, right? It's a horrible way to die.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I wanted to ask you about one more topic that I've been hearing about more in the last few years, and that's related to indoor heat
Yeah.
risk. With the explosion of warehouse operations all over the world, I'm starting to hear more and more about how difficult conditions can be indoors. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, and you're 100% right, and you're actually hitting it the nail on the head. And actually, California and Cal OSHA is actually leading the charge on this. And in California, there's been the rise of the warehouse, right? The Amazon warehouses, the Prologis warehouses, just they're going up everywhere, right? And they're massive buildings and they're state of the art, right? But because
Hmm.
they're so massive and because their dock doors are open and they're forklifts and everything you could think of, and they're in Southern California predominantly. I mean, they're everywhere, but especially the ones in Southern California, it's hot. And even though you're inside, you don't think it's going to be hot. It is hot, right? So Cal OSHA under CCR 8, I believe it is. I'll have to when we add in the links. We'll add in the links here to the different regulations and the new stats about indoor heat prevention. But Cal OSHA has really led the way, and they've put in exact temperatures, right? And I believe it's either 82 or 84 degrees, right? Ambient temperature these measurements have to be put in place. They require exact amount of distance away from the workplace that water has to be available, the type of water. And let's also go back to that. Gone are the days of everyone being, the old ladle of water and being, we have to make sure that the water is completely clean, that it's potable. It's everyone can have their own cups, right? Single use cups, multi use cups, if there's proper storage for it. Um, they have to have a well ventilated area, whether that's indoors or out, right? But it has to be away from the work area, away from any sort of furnace or any sort of heat source that might be within the warehouse as well or within the manufacturing area. And this definitely applies. That's also too. It's not just warehouses. This applies to all indoor work areas, right now in the state of California. Um, and it has to be accessible to them at all times during their shift, right? But yeah, the rise of these warehouses really has spurred on a lot of the states to create indoor heat illness prevention regulation. And like I said, California is leading the way, but Nevada, Arizona, and several others have joined in. And when you're dealing with state OSHA versus federal OSHA, you have to remember that if it's not existent, then fine. But anything a state does has to actually meet or exceed the federal OSHA requirements. It cannot be under, right? So anytime a state like California makes a new regulation as far as maybe say heat illness or something, it has to equal or be greater than the federal. So it's
Hmm.
actually most of the time it's going to be more stringent, which is the case with California's.
No, that's good to know. That is all the questions that I had for our conversation today. Is there anything else you wanted to add, or any tidbits of
Yeah.
heat
Um,
information?
so when we're training people on heat illness and we're talking with our workforce about heat illness, although we're really focused on it about they're at work and applying it, they're at work and using the buddy system, watching out for each other, managers watching out for supervisors, supervisors watching out for the front line. It really is so applicable to your everyday life, especially during this time of year. And there's some stats that I want to just share real quick. you know every year during this time of year, the July through August into September, the amount of people that die at public parks in Southern California, during barbecues or sporting events, at like Dodger Stadium, for instance, actually goes through the roof during this time of year because, you're there with your family, you're having fun, you're drinking whatever you're drinking, right? Adult beverages, not really drinking water, and you're enjoying yourself, and people might look at you and just think, oh, he's had too many adult beverages, right? But it's actually the signs and symptoms of heat stroke and heat exhaustion, and it's escalating, right? And and sometimes it happens that to where it goes unnoticed for too long, right? So these heat exhaustion or heat illness prevention measures really can apply to your workers' everyday life, right? During this time of year, right? Making sure kids are drinking water, making sure that they're taking breaks, because kids, last thing kids want to do is stop playing, right? Making sure that they're getting some shade, they're getting out of the sun, right? Or that they're wearing long sleeves. People tend to forget during the summertime, if you have a workforce out working outside, you don't actually want to show as much skin as possible, to get the ventilation. You actually want to cover up as much as possible, right? Get those UV off of your skin, get that cool air staying in, get that evaporation going on within your shirt, not externally.
Yeah.
So different dress codes, different measures, but again, I can't stress that enough, that how much it applies to everyday life, not just your occupational career.
No, those are good tips.
I've worked in some of the hottest places on earth, whether it's the Middle East or parts of Africa. And if you look at the Badoons out in the Lost Quarters, right? Um, they are covered head to toe, right? They are literally covered head to toe, even their face,
Hmm.
right? And it's 127 degrees outside. You might think that, wow, they got a lot of clothes on, but there's a reason for that. They know how to deal with the sun, right? Keep the
Yeah.
UV off of you, and it's going to cool you down. It's the actual opposite effects. Now, you don't want insulating clothes like, a sweatshirt, but nice, loose clothing of a light color, that's got to be part of your campaign as well, right? Is informing people on, and even dietary needs and dietary eating. If you're coming to work for me framing houses and it's going to be 95 degrees before, the next day, during our safety meeting the day before, we're going to talk about the high heat, and I'm going to remind everyone, and not to parent everyone, but hey, tonight, avoid a heavy meat meal, right? Don't just go home and eat a whole bunch of brisket and a bunch of barbecue. Try to eat something light, something fresh. Make sure to drink some glasses of water before you go to bed, right? Because you wake up, a couple glasses of water before you go to bed will wake you up. You're already starting, hydrated, right? And we'll actually talk about that. We'll talk about dressing, eating, um, proper ways to dehydrate, proper ways to rehydrate, right? Ways to avoid dehydration. And so during this time of year, it becomes a whole lifestyle of heat illness, right? And heat illness prevention.
That's interesting. I like that idea of, coaching your teams, your frontline workers to be conscious of that in between shifts, not just first thing in the morning, maybe mention something in
Oh,
the afternoon,
huge.
but helping them be aware of it, when they're home at night.
Something that's huge for dehydration and stuff that not a lot of people consider is when you're dehydrated, you're not dehydrated right now, you're dehydrated from before, right? And it's already, the effects are already in place, right? So when you have to get rehydrated, you're actually fighting an uphill battle, right? So staying hydrated, making sure you're taking those water breaks, making sure that you're hydrating with electrolytes. And by the way, water itself will not hydrate you in high temperatures, that you're sweating and you're profusely sweating and stuff. You have to replace those electrolytes. So as an employer or as an employee, you have to make sure that you have those electrolytes available, right? Whether it's the tablets, the powders, electrolyte drinks, right? They have to be available, because water alone, even though water is great, it can only be about 80 to 90% of it. You have to have some electrolytes in there as well.
Well, thanks, Brian, for spending some time with me again today. Your insights are always appreciated. You've got a lot of good information that I think other people will find very helpful as well.
Yeah, it's one of these things that am passionate about, and heat illness prevention. Again, it goes back to my saying at the beginning of this. It's one of the true industry hazards that it's completely avoidable, right? It's completely avoidable. We can make sure that no one has to get to that point, and we can maintain a safe and healthy workforce, which is a productive workforce, and that's ultimately the goal at the end of the day, right?
Yep. All right. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.